one interesting use case, decentralized identity in particular being one interesting use case of having keys. Namely, in this presentation, a lot of it deals specifically with this kind of format, the roadmap to decentralized identity, namely the goal. So what are we trying to achieve with all of this? What paradigms are we changing in the process and how are we getting there? The obstacles that might get in the way, the standards that bring us there, jokingly the blockchain, and going over kind of strides that have been made in the space with wallets towards decentralized identity, and lastly the path forward. So kind of like what's next, where does this all go? So getting started off is the goal. And the first thing here is saying sunsetting the age of surveillance capitalism. Namely, there was a book by an author, Shoshana Zuboff, specifically detailing this idea of surveillance capitalism, where a lot of companies had free reign to essentially mine data on you, the whole idea of the user being the product, and their entire operations were just predicated on the amount of data they can honestly harvest on users and utilize for profits in the process. Whereas users, we thought this was free the entire time. But the model specifically being a user interacting with a service, logging into that service, sharing that data with that service, and that service may or may not giving access back, may or may not giving a user this data in a very accessible or tangible form afterwards, and kind of keeping things on lockdown. And a lot of the idea with decentralized identity is preventing that, is that a user at the end of the day with their credentials and their data are coming to services instead, and instead of users having to log into services, share their data with those services, instead the service has to log into a user's data vault, and the user has to consent along the way to their data being used. Secondly, going into that, interoperable self-managed data, specifically the user now being in control of this. User not just saying like, now the user's in control, but also the user having a say where that data is stored, where that data lives, and how it's to be managed. And lastly, granular data controls that are easy to use. So zero trust architecture, basically preventing these kind of like widespread access controls, and instead users having, or rather services having more granularity about how something happens, who has access to what, and how responses are handled, moving more towards a model of like principle of least privilege. So just having access for to perform a specific action and nothing else, rather than you have this role, for example, and have all of these permissions. So a lot of the goal of decentralized identity is going from previous models to something more that is user controlled and more granular access patterns as well. Secondly, what are the obstacles in the way of us getting to decentralized identity? Well, in the context of wallets in particular, part of it here is key management, which is the first thing I'll say is that thankfully, I have to say in terms of wallets being at WalletCon, crypto wallets have probably been one of the most successful bootstrapping of like public key infrastructure. Back in the day, just having no interfaces to having the interfaces that we use in the form of wallets to manage keys, sign interactions, sign transactions has been a game changer, honestly. And I'm not going to stand here and say that things are perfect. There's still a lot of problems with key management to solve. I can't expect like a family member to be like, here's a 12-word phrase, go bury it somewhere. And we've gotten a lot better at that. There's talks about account abstraction, how do we do these kind of delegation models, how do we handle our keys a lot better, custodial wallets, multi-custody wallets, self-custodial, like having options. It's getting a lot better and better, but it's still not perfect, which was why it's still an obstacle. The first one here is that users don't trust brands with their most critical data. When I talked about users custodying data earlier, and the problem is it's hard to expect someone to like fully be the custodian over their own data, because sometimes using a third-party service is a pretty easy hack and a very easy way to do something like this. So figuring out the right balance with a user self-hosting their own data, or finding a balance between self-hosting and using a third-party service, but always making sure that there's an eject button at the end of the day. That if a user does go with a third-party service, there's always a way for a user to say, if I ever wanted to host this on the server in my basement, I could. Third, standardized data formats. So basically all the data that's going in and out speaking the same language, so that different services can interpret these data that a user is bringing in similar ways. A very basic version of this is like if a user brings a credential that has a Twitter account linked to an Ethereum account, how does the service know what kind of credential that is? Is there like a common schema we could all point to and say, yep, that's a Twitter credential? Fourth, standards and specifications don't guarantee winning products. Network effects are critical. Good example of this is like we could kind of standardize things as much as we can try, but at the end of the day, sometimes if something has mass adoption, it just becomes a form of de facto standard. Think about the EVM, right? Came out, people love the thing. It's not the greatest thing on earth, but it just became a de facto standard for a lot of chains to build on because it had the network effects that were there. So finding the right balance between standards development and also network effects, and then privacy preservation, obviously making sure that users are protected at the end of the day, which is critical to decentralized identity. And for this, we can also talk about those two in particular being top of mind, that standards are key to decentralized identity being mainstream, is that we all have to understand these different data formats, we all have to make sure we agree to certain schemas, we all have to make sure we also agree to certain interfaces for users as well. And there's a lot of standards groups out there. There's W3C, IETF, ISO, NIST, and a bunch of others that basically have created the standards that dictate a lot of what we use today. I would say that the Web3 standards groups are a lot more fun and a lot more flexible, but we appreciate the hardening of traditional standards groups, and we're also participants in Spruce. And talking about earlier, standards are based on network effects. De facto standards exist, and these are things like PDFs, for example, which weren't like a traditional standard, but Adobe's like, here's this thing that works super well, and eventually ISO's like, yeah, there it is, it works pretty well. MP3s came out as like a competitor to WAV files. Even Microsoft Word's doc files, they weren't like traditionally standardized, but they just became de facto standards due to people using them all the time. And standards are not the end goal for decentralized identity, because you might have situations where network effects are dominant. Again, EVM being a big part of that, but sign-in with Ethereum, which I'll talk about later, was a standard that came from different approaches. And traction and network effects is like the one way to make all of this work. And a big part of it is standards alignment, the politics of all of this, which is one of the hardest things. And bringing it back to Web3 for a second, it's like when we want to build these applications that use decentralized identity, we need standard ways of representing these things. And I know it's a cliche example that everyone hates, but when you go like decentralized ride sharing, which it's become a joke the last couple of years, but it highlights a good example, because if you really want to reduce the trust portion of the transaction, that trust portion where Uber's handling the verification of a driver, so you don't just send a transaction to a smart contract and go into the next black car that pulls up and trust that person with your life for the next 20 minutes, you need to agree upon what is a standard format for someone with a car with 4 doors. What does it look like when someone brings their insurance credential? What does it look like for a driver's license even, which is a form of standard? And agreeing on these things is what starts to unblock these use cases, because that's just how it happens. So going into these as well, just like it's how you get to privacy preserving digital identity attestations. How do we do like the cryptography over that? And then eventually portable data for social media presence. How do we have these decentralized social media apps that convey this information across front ends? Why blockchain? Greatest key adoption event, like I mentioned, censorship resistant, strong network effects, and also user controlled identifiers. You have a bunch of people with keys that they could use kind of towards controlling their own identity at the start of it. And one thing I'll mention is like how standards play at work towards decentralized identity in blockchain world. Standardizing something like signing with Ethereum, which was a large group effort, because everyone in blockchain land, when they wanted to establish a session with someone, like OpenSea, when you would go edit your profile, have a different way of showing what you're signing as a user. Basically, they'll have a message for you saying, hey, you're signing into OpenSea, with like a little bit of extra information. And then some other service would have like a random string of letters and numbers saying, sign the magic message. You don't know what the hell you're doing. So part of this was, okay, there is no de facto standard for signing into apps. You need to make one. Because once you make that standard message saying, hey, you're signing in with Ethereum, going back to how standards unlock these new products and these new network effects, wallets can then take this standard, like signing with Ethereum, and show a user a sign-in interface instead of just sign the message. They could tell the user, hey, that domain you're on doesn't actually match what you're signing. And this is only because they know exactly how to read that and what they're interpreting in the process. I might not have time for that, but going to the path forward, talking about standards in Web3 land, there's a lot that's going on between EIPs that get standardized. I always like to plug CASA, the Chain Agnostic Standards Alliance, at chainagnostic.org, where a lot of development on standards that cross chains are being developed. But at the end of the day, part of it is like getting things additionally standardized, working with blockchain wallets. Extent for our end, as Spruce, a lot of it deals specifically with extending signing with Ethereum, which requires its own form of standards work. But we always like to highlight that a lot of these interactions have been driven through standards development, finding de facto standards, and finding the balance between the two. Because if you really want to unlock these decentralized identity interactions, we all have to start and agree on what a Twitter credential looks like, even in the low assurance use cases, before we go straight to KYC. So, yeah. And so begins the key-controlled revolution. And thank you all again. Yeah. Oh, so a lot of the work we're doing on extending standards is with additional standards. So like what happens after authentication? Well, part of it's like, what if you could also include authorizations? So if a application wanted to read from a user's like off-chain resource, like an off-chain data vault, how do you essentially have a user be able to sign in with Ethereum and in that same interaction also authorize access, like read access or write access to that off-chain resource? And in the sign in with Ethereum message, making sure that if that authorization is happening, having a standard where the user has a human readable message that says, I hereby authorize access to these resources, and just knowing what they're doing along the way, because the only way for a user to know what they're doing along the way is if there is kind of a standard for it, or at least a human readable way to do it that folks agree upon.